OK, tak dobrý večer všetkým. Začnem po slovensky. Ďakujem vám, že ste prišli, lebo naozaj hlbokým nedorozumením sa stalo, že sme tu ešte aj tento týždeň a viem, že už sme tu nemali byť. Takže sa vám ospravedlňujem, ale v čase, keď sme organizovali tie prednášky, tak sme ešte netušili, ako bude zorganizovaný harmonogram akademického roku, takže vďaka, že ste tu. And now I will switch to English. This is our last lecture, actually in this 10th year of the project Reflections on Architecture, and I'm happy that you are all here and that we have our dear guest with us here today at the evening, which is the architect Clementine Blakemore, and she's the founder of the studio Clementine Blakemore Architects. As you can see, she represents the young scene of British architecture, and yeah, she is also, if I can tell this, also a sculptor. So it will be a kind of interdisciplinary, I hope, a little bit. And Clementine has behind her quite a lot of works dealing with sometimes very small interventions, but I mean, it might be very interesting for you because next year you will start your own careers and perhaps it might be like inspirative for your careers at the beginning. And yeah, she will probably tell more about this later. So I don't want to waste my time, waste her time, of course, not mine, waste Clem's time. And I just want to add that she has also experiences with teaching. She has guided a course on Architecture Association in School of Architecture in London. And yeah, now she's occupied completely with her architecture work. So thank you, Clem, for coming and welcome. And the floor is yours, of course.
Brilliant. Well,
please give.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's an absolute honor to be speaking as part of a group of British architects whose work I really admire. And it's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to visit your beautiful city for a couple of days. So I run a small practice based in East London. It started out as just me when I founded it in 2016, and we've grown to around 7 in the years since. I'd love to say that we have a business plan and that I know exactly where we'll be in 5 to 10 years, but in fact I think the practice has grown really organically and kind of ebbed and flowed around the arrival of my 2 babies. Now that they're both at school as of this September, things are much more predictable and stable, and the practice could grow. But I think that actually finding a balance between the practice and my family is actually one of my kind of preoccupations at the moment alongside the work. So if I ever do get around to writing that business plan, I think that will actually be at the heart of it. Oh, is it changing? No. Sorry. There you go. So do we actually want to turn the lights down? Can you see that clearly? I don't know if you can see it, but so I think my main strategy, based on some good advice from a former tutor, has really been to be ready when opportunities arise, as well as having quite a clear set of principles or values to guide the work. So that's being inventive while also rooted in a strong sense of place and history, inclusive, and with a really positive social and environmental impact. I know that you're all students, and the projects that I'm going to talk about this evening really kind of demonstrate the overlap between my own studies and the start of my practice. For me, that's really how my practice started. I spent less than a year working for another architect after graduating before jumping in the deep end, possibly because I started architecture fairly late, around 25, after a fine art and sculpture degree and a couple of years working in film. So I was quite impatient to kind of start designing real-world projects. I actually chose to start my architectural training in Hale County, West Alabama, at the Rural Studio, which some of you may have come across. It was set up in the early 90s by Sambo Mockbee, who had wanted to teach students not only the hands-on craft of building, but really the ethics of the profession, how to become, in his words, citizen architects. So undergraduate students from Auburn University were invited to this tiny town of less than 100 people to design and then actually build architecture for the community. So running through the student work, which encompasses a whole range of projects, from houses like this one to youth clubs and libraries, is a belief that all architecture, however modest, affordable, and practical, should also be soulful. So when I joined in 2009, I was part of a one-year outreach program with 2 other students working on an ongoing research project exploring prototype houses that were affordable, replicable, and commercially viable. There were no books in the dilapidated barn where we were studying, but there were plenty of buildings to learn from. So the area was dotted with these Greek revival mansions built before the Civil War on profits from cotton plantations and slavery, as well as dwellings like this that Walker Evans had photographed in the 1930s to document the struggle of farmers in the Great Depression. And whilst these buildings are in many ways symbolic of hardship, they're also illustrative of a really strong southern vernacular, so shutters, porches, local timber siding, modest but dignified, of the place and appropriate for the climate. But unfortunately, these are what nearly 40% of the population live in, prefabricated mobile homes that are unsafe, ugly, and expensive. So they're sold with really high interest loans that take years to pay back, only to depreciate in value like a car. So the studio's 20K house project seeks to address this by designing a series of homes that are affordable and dignified. And our proposal was designed to be expandable over time, with a deep porch cut into the center of the plan, steps spanning the full width, creating a social space engaging with the street. And we spent 8 months designing, using computers, models, but also a lot of hand-drawn details, some of which were drawn actually at 1-to-1 on long rolls of paper that we'd sort of hang from the studio walls. Mock-ups, so here taping out the spaces 1-to-1. And then eventually these cartoons to get our head around construction. And then we started on site, so that's me in a digger, building it from scratch. And I have to say that was a really empowering experience, as well as hugely educational. So I'm not involved in construction anymore, but I really think that those early experiences do still inform how I design, as well as how I approach the kind of resolution of issues on site. So handing the house over to our client, Mac, who'd previously been living in that tiny little trailer you can see on the right, was hugely fulfilling. It's not the most inventive of the rural studio projects, but it set a really high standard for a very rigorously researched brief, a very lean approach to construction, and a very significant social impact that I still aspire to and refer back to today. After that, I came back to London and joined the AA. And I have to say that after the absolute sense of purpose that I'd felt in Alabama, I found the very theoretical nature of the work there quite frustrating. So by the end of my undergraduate studies, I'd actually formed a collective with 2 other students. And together we initiated a collaboration with an engineering firm who was acting pro bono. And we, as part of the AA's visiting school program, sort of designed and then built a new classroom for an educational charity in India. We moved to Dehradun to develop the brief and sort of do the groundwork, and then 12 international students joined us. So we went from making a bamboo mock-up to the real thing in about 10 days. And it was a really successful example, I think, of the idea of the building project being a sort of social event, a platform for exchange and learning. It was a very simple portal frame structure, but the key idea was this relationship with the trees and the playground, and this sort of idea of retaining the advantages of outdoor teaching that we'd seen in the school. So we ended up securing funding from the British Council for another project, and at the end of the year, there was quite a lot of interest in the work. There was an exhibition, the projects were published, and we were asked to present it at talks and lectures. But I was quite uncertain about working abroad again. I was a bit doubtful about operating in the quite complex world of international development, and very aware that we were just beginning to sort of gain the local wisdom that we needed right at the point when we were kind of leaving and on the plane home. And I became very conscious of the rural studio philosophy of being a neighbor, of sort of sticking around long enough that you can really be responsible for what you've built and learn from it, both the mistakes and the successes. So when I joined the Royal College of Art for my master's, I was really eager to find a way of working in a similar way, quite close to home. One of my tutors had a rural research and fabrication workshop where students can live and work for short periods of time. And just over the road was a school, which I approached in the summer before my 5th year to kind of offer to do a project for them. This was a few years after Michael Gove, who was the then Education Secretary under the Conservative government, had claimed that employing architects to design schools was a waste of money. So the project was really a polemic, proposing an alternative way to deliver a school building through a partnership between academia, providing design and building services through me, and then industry, who would provide in-kind expertise or donate materials. And the school site was formed of the original Victorian building, and then a number of single-story extensions which had been added to over time. So the double-pitched silhouette of the new pavilion, which I built, was informed not only by the roofscape of the school buildings, but also by the local vernacular of barns with multiple roof pitches of different scales, as well as the really kind of graphic geometry of Agnes Martin's artwork. Early sketch modeled explored this triangular form, and then working very closely with Webb Yates engineers, Steve was a tutor on the master's course, and I kind of roped him into doing this project pro bono with me. But together with him, we worked very closely and developed this reciprocal frame structure. So that's formed of a series of kind of tapered timber members, each resting on the adjacent one, which seemed in a way like a quite nice metaphor for the kind of collaborative nature of the project. So we resolved the design through these one-to-one mock-ups and models, and then in preparation for a design and build workshop that I ran over the Easter holidays, again as part of this AA visiting school program. Many of the materials had been donated by local companies, and the timber was donated by Hook Park, which is an amazing place. It's a managed woodland in Dorset that's run by the AA as their kind of rural campus. So over the course of 2 weeks, we CNC milled and hand sanded each of the 170 timber members. This was us at the end of that process, sitting proudly on top of them all, and then assembled the frames on the school playground, lifting them into place by hand. Unfortunately, no hard hats or high vis. I would not recommend doing that. And I think as in India, I was exploring this idea of learning through collaboration and hand-on building. But it was also a way, like many of my early projects, to get things off the ground and built with absolutely tiny budgets. So this was me finishing off the roof structure one weekend later that summer, by which point I'd graduated and was working in London. And the building was phased to allow for incremental completion as the funding and resources became available. So phase 1 was used as a covered shelter for play. And then for phase 2, I ran a series of workshops with the school children, exploring options for how to enclose the space as an interior classroom. Not so much a co-design process, but more really to extend and expand the building project as an educational opportunity. The work involved stripping the structure back to the frame so it could be insulated and clad. And I think there's a really nice contrast in the finished building between the very opaque timber front elevation, clad in vertical larch weatherboard, and then the rear elevation, which is clad in this translucent polycarbonate panels, which emit this really generous, even northern light into the space. We worked with local furniture designers to create storage solutions, so large drawers below a bench, and then these pegs on the rear wall, which you can hang musical instruments from. And I think what's really nice in the summer is that you can kind of open up the whole front and it kind of becomes a much more public and performative space. So it's a very modest building, both in scale and budget, but I think that its spirit, in terms of its social impact and in terms of the kind of uplifting character of the space created, is something that I felt set a good tone for the start of the practice. So whilst I kind of pitched that project, that pavilion, as the practice's first building, really it was a kind of self-initiated student project that had been a total labor of love, with my expenses covered at a very basic level with grants. I'd done a handful of smaller structures, like pavilions for the Design Museum in London and the Dorset Wildlife Trust, but Wraxall Yard, which I started in 2018, was my first proper building commission and really a huge step up in scale. To give you a sense of this, the value of the pavilion, including in the in-kind donations, was about £75,000, and Wraxall Yard ended up being about 2.8 million. So it was a kind of real baptism of fire in the best possible way. And I think a great example of what I mentioned earlier about kind of being ready when opportunities arise and jumping on them. So the client for this project, Nick Reed, is a farmer, and at the point that I met him, he'd recently acquired some additional land for his organic farm in West Dorset. And the way he tells the story, the buildings were essentially thrown in for free with the purchase. They hadn't been used for about 20 years, so they were completely derelict. There'd been a lot of damage to the roofs, and therefore to the internal timber structure below, which was completely rotten, as well as to the stone walls, which had been repaired with cement blockwork and mortar, in turn causing more damage. Nonetheless, I think the bones of the building were very beautiful. So there's pale Portland stone, red clay double Roman roof tiles, queen post timber trusses, as well as this quite unusual typology of a fold yard sitting on the edge of a hamlet next to this really beautiful 12th century chapel. So all of this was a very inspiring starting point for the project. The brief was kind of half-formed at the time that Nick appointed us, and there were two very personal motivations. Firstly, his mother had suffered from multiple sclerosis and had really struggled to find adequate, inclusive accommodation. So places which were technically compliant with wheelchair use felt really institutional. And secondly, another close family member had suffered from very poor mental health, and a big part of her recovery had been leaving London and being able to spend time outdoors in the countryside. So the very broad idea was to create inclusive holiday accommodation, as well as access to the natural world, and thereby kind of improve well-being. But beyond that, the brief was very open. And so we proposed a quite long, very early research and feasibility study to kind of tease out firmer ambitions for the project. The scheme that emerged was for 5 dwellings arranged around the fold yard, with a community space and a kind of educational farm building in the south. I think making the accessibility of the site as subtle and well integrated into the overall design was a key kind of driving principle. So the entrance is reached via a winding path from the car park with a very gentle slope that mitigates the need for a ramp or a handrail. And that master plan created 2 quite distinct areas. So a very densely planted courtyard, a very tranquil space, predominantly for the overnight guests. And then a much more agricultural and kind of public farmyard, housing a restored Dutch barn, this steel structure you see there, which offers opportunities for visitors to kind of interact with farming and animals. So the site is run as a not-for-profit, and it partners with an amazing charity to provide supported holidays for disabled guests. And it also regularly hosts charitable events in the community space, such as this gathering for a group of isolated elderly people who came for the day. And I think if access to the natural world was really at the heart of the brief, the way we tried to achieve that architecturally was through a series of kind of visual and physical connections to the landscape beyond the buildings. There was an existing gap between the cattle stalls on the west of the site, and we created 2 additional cuts or punctures through the building fabric. Firstly, on the eastern edge, to create what we call the breezeway, which serves as the entrance and frames the view into the courtyard. And also on the northern edge, what we call the cross passage, which provides access to the orchard, the pasture, and then the timber boardwalk beyond. And that's a really special part of the project, which allows wheelchair users to explore independently beyond the buildings and deeper into the landscape. And I think one of the things that's really nice about these spaces, which are covered but open on both sides, is their slight ambiguity in terms of use. We always imagine the breezeway as somewhere you might pause or kids would play. And it's been really gratifying to see that that is actually exactly how it's occupied. I think another client might well have prioritized extra bedrooms or the kind of commercial driver, but I think that this looseness really allows the site to breathe, and it gives the buildings a more humane and communal quality. They're also really valuable spaces for nesting birds and bats, and I think that kind of integration of wildlife into the building fabric is something that we're really, really interested in exploring in some of our current projects. I think in terms of our approach to the fabric itself, there was already a really interesting history of reuse in the form of these ecclesiastical fragments, which are embedded in the gable ends. The Latin term for this ancient practice of repurposing building materials is spolia, and I think it represents a kind of attitude to construction, both practical and aesthetic, that really informed our way of thinking. So although we salvaged as much as possible, the damage was so extensive that everything other than the walls was really stripped off to be sorted and repaired. And there were definitely a few months on site when it felt like we were going backwards rather than forward. We worked incredibly closely with the engineer, on this occasion, fantastic firm called Structure Workshop, to develop an appropriate strategy. So this is one of their many, many drawings that mapped the repair and relocation of the timber trusses. Many of the bearing ends needed replacing, and the design of these was intentionally agricultural, so using timber salvaged from elsewhere on the site and very simple bolted connections. Pete, the engineer, had this almost like a motto, which was, how would a farmer do it? Let's not overcomplicate it, let's just do it how a farmer would do it. And I think if the design team were sort of really important collaborators, so too were the craftspeople working on the site. It was actually a real struggle to find a stonemason who understood the craft, in particular working with lime, which is a much slower and more involved process than using cement. But once Tony, this lead mason, came on board, we found we could trust him, I think, not only with the care required technically, but also with kind of some of the decisions involved when creating a new opening, repairing a wall, or judging the extent of repointing. I think one of the things I learned on this project was that however many drawings you prepare in the studio, really with a building like this, a lot of the design does still happen at site. And I think it's really nice in the finished project that you can very much see the kind of hands of all the makers in the end result. Alongside the restoration of the buildings was the introduction of new elements. So structurally, the approach was to expose and celebrate as much as possible, and in doing so, be really honest about what was original and what was new. So for the purlins, which all had to be replaced, we really embraced the contrast between the new Douglas fir timber and the original Baltic redwood, which had sort of darkened and aged. Equally around the courtyard walls, where the trusses land on new columns, the junction is left unlined, so you can see that connection. Thermally, a really key consideration was the use of natural materials, not only for their low embodied carbon, but also to allow the building to breathe. For the roof, we used this wood fiber insulation, which is incredibly good at mitigating solar gain. Obviously, it's a lot of roof, and the attic space is part of the building, so that was quite an important consideration. And then for the walls, we used a lime leveling plaster, followed by cork insulation. Unfortunately, both those materials are imported, the wood fibers from Germany and the corks from Portugal. The UK isn't great at producing these types of materials yet, but still it was great to use such low carbon options. And I think that approach was also adopted in terms of the heat source, which is a biomass boiler using locally sourced wood chip that was housed in the Dutch barn. And while this is actually the only building to retain an agricultural use, we really wanted to reinforce the vernacular language across the site. So this very simple vertical timber cladding, known as Yorkshire boarding, was repeated in many places. So here in the breezeway, as well as the community space, where we just had a small alteration, such as turning the planks perpendicular above the opening to create more permeable sort of fins and that connection between the two spaces. We also borrowed the hit and miss brickwork found in 19th century hay barns. So this is an image from a reference book that is a kind of one of a series documenting British vernacular farm buildings, which became the kind of Bible for us to refer to. And we borrowed that language for the repair of the workshop building, so replacing a course of blockwork along the top with reclaimed bricks cut into specials to create this very distinctive diamond motif. We were lucky that there was a whole series of lean-tos at the back of the building, which, because they'd been built with lime plaster, it meant it was very easy to kind of demolish them and reuse the brick. So it's another great reason for using lime, as just thinking about buildings at the end of their lifespan. I think one of the other things we really enjoyed in the existing buildings was the very ad hoc nature of some of the elevations. And we really retained this very eclectic mix of openings, playing with the location of the glazing, creating very deep reveals for windows which framed the view to the woodland beyond, and also playful little nooks at low level. I fully admit that this is a staged photograph. That was my son. But it's true that kids do gravitate there, and dogs, and also actually for wheelchair users who are at a lower level, getting that glimpse out is really beautiful. I think with the interiors more generally, we wanted the very simple, robust material palette we'd used externally to continue inside. So we had this dark grey GGBS concrete floor and exposed spruce plywood sheathing as the ceiling finish. We worked incredibly hard with the Centre for Accessible Environments, as well as a number of wheelchair users who we consulted with directly, to get as close as possible to what's called Part M Category 3 of the British Building Regulations, which is the kind of higher standard. But at the same time, recognizing that these were short-term holiday lets, as well as historic buildings with some unavoidable constraints in terms of space. So for example, while all the kitchens have these height-adjustable worktops, which a wheelchair user can kind of slide underneath to cook independently, they're actually shorter than required for full-time dwellings. But the ambition, I think, was for all these inclusive features to be integrated really seamlessly into the interiors. And part of that was just to do with specification. So in this case, choosing sinks with these integrated grab handles to avoid the kind of visual clutter of two wall-mounted rails, as well as bespoke solutions. So this was a partially recessed track for the ceiling hoist into the underside of the truss, and then also commissioning the joiner to make solid Douglas fir surrounds for the profiling beds instead of the kind of plastic veneers that they come with as standard. And each of these was relatively a small move, but I think collectively have a really big impact in terms of the atmosphere and the dignity of the place as a whole. And finally, I just want to touch on the landscape design by Hortus Collective, which is a really significant part of the scheme. I think, firstly, as a counterpoint to the very fixed sculptural qualities of the architecture, which kind of softens it, but also adds this temporal element to the project as it grows and changes seasonally. And then also in terms of creating privacy and moments of intimacy within the courtyard, which is otherwise very much a kind of shared collective space. When we first visited the site, plants had started to grow through the concrete hard standing, and I think we wanted to echo that in the very naturalistic planting scheme that was developed. And it's also really beneficial in terms of biodiversity, creating a much prolonged nectar source for pollinators. So the project won a few awards, and I think one of the nicest things about that process was actually the chance to go back to the building on a number of occasions to show the juries around, 2 years or so after it had been finished. It was an amazing opportunity to see how spaces had been occupied and really reflect on the design process for me and the client. Nick actually ended up writing something down about the impact that the project has had over the past 2 years, which I thought I'd share. Just have a sip of water first. He said, "Most weeks, a disabled visitor or their carer will express their thanks, and I'll sit down with them while they tell me their story. Invariably, these are about how tough their lives are, how disability has robbed them or the person they're caring for of careers, hobbies, freedom, and dignity. They talk about the unfairness of a built environment that ignores and abuses them, one that offers them inadequate and ugly spaces or denies them space altogether. What Wraxall provides is a calm place to breathe out, and their emotional response to the design are profound and very moving." So I think the project demonstrates that inclusive design isn't about compromise or restrictions, but rather generosity, something that benefits all of us and can really kind of enrich rather than deplete architectural quality. Sambo Mockbey's famous maxim was that everyone deserves a shelter for the soul, and I really hope that's what we created at Wraxall Yard. I think that project led to a number of other very interesting rural projects, including this one, which has just started on site, which is the restoration of a medieval threshing barn, which we discovered from this archive photo would have had a thatched roof and what's described as a traditional cruck timber frame internally, which we're reinstating using a slightly more contemporary interpretation, as well as a national research centre for the Somerset Wildlife Trust, which we won as part of an open competition, and we're about to submit planning for that. But the other project I want to speak about this evening is a very different typology in scale and in terms of the urban context. Like Wraxall Yard was at the time, it was a very pivotal project for the practice. It's a collaboration with a brilliant firm called Witherford Watson Mann Architects, who you might know, and they invited us to join them on a competition to renovate the Royal College of Art in Kensington, which we won and have been working on since last summer. So the original buildings were designed by Cadbury Brown in the 50s for a very prominent site facing Hyde Park. And I think this description by Ian Nairn at the time it was completed captures it very well as smouldering through to your consciousness with quiet intensity, purple brick and concrete aggregate humped up against the Albert Hall like a gruff egalitarian greeting. It was actually a trio of buildings. So this 8-story tower seen here, housing studios and workshops for a range of disciplines and courses, which was topped off by an amazing glass house on the highest level with tropical plants and carp fish as a way for the students to engage and draw from the natural world, which was sadly closed in the 80s. Then there was a common block and a library on the other side of the courtyard. And finally, this quite sculptural building, which was the main entrance and held more public-facing exhibitions and event spaces, which is also where The Clash played in 1976, in the kind of heyday of the RCA. And there have been various alterations in the 80s by Sue Rogers and John Miller, as well as a library extension in the 90s by Wright and Wright, which in some ways were successful. But the attention on Battersea, where the RCA has been building a second campus for the past 15 years, so you might recognize the Howth Tompkins building on the left and the Herzog and de Moran building on the right. The emphasis has really been on that project, and there's also been immense pressure on space as a result of a significant increase in student numbers, and it's really kind of led to the neglect of the original site in Kensington. So the carving up of spaces has led to this really awful windowless meeting rooms like this, installation of kind of short-term solutions to changes in learning, like pods for Zooms, and quite generic fit-out of social spaces, which are kind of cheap and efficient to procure, but don't really suit the character of an art school. As well as lots of visual clutter, flat-screen TVs advertising the lunch offer, and quite sort of short-term solutions. So in this case, it was a temporary toilet block inserted in the middle of what was once quite an elegant stair. As well as a very striking lack of any artwork, which seems like a really kind of unfortunate missed opportunity given the caliber of work produced by the community. And one of the things we heard when we did early engagement was how much people felt the building had kind of lost its soul, to again use that word that Sambo Mockbey used. So when we got the brief from the college, it was very practical to close a temporary campus that they'd opened during some building works at Battersea, to remove and replace some faulty concrete and carry out refurbishment works. And what we added was this idea, this fourth cog of collective culture, so that alongside the very practical parts of the brief, it was really important to see this as an opportunity to celebrate the creativity of the community and really reinforce its identity. One of the people we spoke to was the interior designer, Abe Rogers, who studied and taught there, and he made this really interesting comparison between the college and the city. And in a way, I think that kind of summarizes how we've approached the project so far, focusing very much on the shared collective space and its relationship with the public realm spaces around the edges of the building. The first move is to reopen the original front door facing the Royal Albert Hall, which was closed when that space became studio space, as well as form a new opening on the right, so a puncture on what was otherwise quite a blank elevation, and also creating a new volume on the roof, which you can see on the left, as additional teaching space, which is very much needed. Internally, we're conceiving of the ground floor as what we're calling a street, with access to a public cafe that can double up as an exhibition space, and then leading on to other kind of student-facing services, as well as looking at the open or green spaces, which have been eroded over time, but are really increasingly important for the well-being of staff and students who are under increasing pressure with the reduction in MA courses from 2 years to 1. And I think in terms of the building fabric, we're restoring as many of the original features as possible. And where we're adding new ones, we're really trying to honor Cadbury Brown's vision of the building as lean and spare, suitable as a backdrop to the art, rather than as an art thing in itself. In the cafe space, this means peeling back the layers of plasterboard to expose the brick and board-marked concrete of the original building. And it's been really exciting recently to sort of see these revealed through opening up works which have started on site. And begin to test methods for stripping back the paint off the concrete. So this is a whole series of samples. In terms of the collaboration with Witherford Watson Mann and ourselves, I think it's evolved very easily over the course of the project. So with them acting as the lead architect and us focusing more on the kind of detailed fit out of the interior spaces. So for the studios, we've been looking at the simple timber furniture and partitions that were used historically, as well as learning from the more successful aspects of the fit out in the new Herzog and de Meuron buildings in Battersea. So this is the very simple timber partitions in the sculpture department. I think not only to kind of avoid reinventing the wheel unnecessarily, but also because it's quite important that there's a connection between the two campuses and there's a sense of continuity between them. So we proposed a very simple set of timber furniture, shelving and partitions that can remain in situ when the furniture is cleared for end-of-year shows. The project's happening in phases to enable the building to remain in use throughout, which is quite complicated for obvious reasons. One person on the board described it as kind of performing open heart surgery, trying to keep it operational while the building work's going on. But we're really trying to use that as an opportunity to kind of respond to what's discovered as the works start. So in this case, we saw that once the vinyl was removed from the floor, there was this concrete finish that actually might work quite well if we just patch repair it and seal it and use it as the finished floor. I think for me, that's sort of one of the pleasures of working with existing buildings, that you can really respond to what you find as things are uncovered. And then in the ground for communal spaces, we've kind of begun to adopt this mantra of starting with the art. So really prioritizing the display of art as a driver for the rest of the decisions in terms of the fit out. So here in the cafe space, we are developing these zones of board material that sit on top of the brick and can be really easily drilled into without covering the brick completely, making it clear where students have permission to engage with the buildings and where they should leave the brick intact. And then identifying locations along the very public-facing elevations, which could be used as a kind of shop window of sorts to show the huge variety of work that's produced within the college. Not only by current students, but also alumni, which includes amazing artists like Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, the painters Chris O'Feely and Tracy Emin. The idea being that you kind of walk into the college and feel connected in a very immediate and visceral way to the legacy of the college and the amazing network of people who kind of pass through it. And we're adopting a similar approach with the furniture specification, trying to choose pieces designed by alumni. One of the really unique things about the RCA is how multidisciplinary it is as a college. So it's not just art, but also design. And finally, I think one of the things that I've really been championing from the start of the project is that we should leave gaps in the design and invite the college community, perhaps recent graduates or members of staff, to contribute to the process. There's an amazing history of this. On the left is a shop designed by James Gowan, who was a tutor in the 80s, was really well known and published at the time and accessible to the public. And on the right was a cafe in the old sculpture block, which was designed by Tom Sermon and Percy Weston, just after they'd graduated from the architecture programs. And there are many other similar historic examples. It's not quite on the same scale as those earlier projects, but our current proposal is to hold an open competition for recent graduates to design planters for indoor plants, a little like this bench competition for the London Festival of Architecture. I think it'll add variety and vibrancy to the design, but will also be a way to embody the talent and skill of the community in the buildings. I remember seeing the Sermon Weston project on the previous page when I was a student and feeling really inspired. So in a way, this comes full circle to the ethos of the Rural Studio and the amazing learning opportunities presented by live, real-world projects. And as well as the way in which kind of education and practice can very much overlap. I'm not sure what opportunities there are for this type of thing at this university, but if there is anything similar, my advice would be to kind of grab it. It doesn't matter if it's small scale, the fact that it's something physical in the real world and being interacted with will teach you a lot. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for making it so short, actually.
I think it is 45. That's on the dot.
Actually, Clementine promised that it will not be long, and she's the only one that really kept the time, so thank you. And I mean, there is much more space for your questions right now. And I would like to thank you for the last comment, because I think this is something we forgot to do at our university, that like to have hands-on these kind of creations, like workshops, open air, and etc., etc. So I don't know, perhaps you miss it as students, or perhaps not, but this is something that might be discussed. Actually, I completely forgot at the beginning to talk about Rural Studio, because this is a kind of phenomenon, and I really wow, that you've been part of it. So congrats.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's amazing how it was just 1 year of my life, quite a long time ago now, but it's something that I reflect on almost daily. I think I learned more in that year than the subsequent 4 years of education.
This is really amazing, because if I remember one professor here, Professor Keppel, he was completely fascinated by this studio, and he was always lecturing about this, and how they are of old, how we call it, pneus, and old possible findings or rubbish, and they built new houses for the people there of this. So this is really something. Okay, but this is not about me to be excited. So please, are there some questions from your side? Please, just take the last possible opportunity to ask. You will ask.
Hi, thank you for your lecture, but I was just wondering something that you hinted early at the beginning of the lecture, saying that you were disappointed at the university that it was way too conceptual and not so technical. You mentioned something in that fashion, right?
Oh, at the AA,
Yeah, and I was just, since we have so many students here, if you could maybe, and since you're an employer right now, if you could comment on what you would wish to learned back then, or what you would wish right now from your position to so that students learn prior to their finishing their degree?
So yeah, my experience at the AA was very much that we had 3 terms. You would spend the whole of the first term developing a brief and kind of exploring a brief. You'd spend the whole of the second term kind of perfecting that and beginning to do a little bit of design. And then you'd have a third term where you'd sort of exhibit. And we never really got to the design part. And I think, the ideas being explored were incredibly interesting, but design, I think, takes practice. And it's a kind of iterative process. And no one really seemed to be that interested in talking about design and details or looking at buildings. We did so few building trips, unlike Rural Studio, where we had no books and just learnt from not only going around buildings and looking at them, but they had this amazing week at the beginning of each semester, which was called Neck Down Week, basically meaning not using your head, just using your body, where all the current students would go around the old projects and basically fix them. So if there was a leaking gutter, you'd get up a ladder and fix the gutter. My job was crawling underneath a building in about that much space and re-stapling the insulation between the joists. But they were, if you want to learn about a detail, getting that intimate with the building is a great way to do it. So I still lack confidence as a designer, and I still lack confidence detailing and with technical design. And I just think that's crazy after so many years of studying to not feel fluent in design. I think it's the case with lots of people graduating. So my advice would be look at buildings and really embrace the iterative process of design.
Okay, thank you. Questions, dear students? Oh, yeah.
Hi, so my question is about the first project you presented. With that farmhouse, you said the budget is 2.8 million, if I'm not mistaken. What was the most expensive part of the project, and how close were you to the 2.8 million budget that you
Well, that was
used?
the end cost.
Oh, that was the end cost.
That was the end cost, yeah. And I don't know what the most expensive part was. I mean, the rebuilding of buildings it would have been much cheaper to knock it down and begin again. Luckily, that wouldn't have been possible because of the planning regulations, and we had a client who was committed to the act of restoration. But that was the first thing that the quantity surveyor said when we did a site visit, is, it would be cheaper to knock it down. So, yeah, I think that probably ended up being slightly less, it cost in the end less than it should have, because it was tendered right at the beginning of COVID during the first lockdown. And after that, so it was a fixed price tender, and then during COVID, prices, across the world went up. So I think we probably got a fairly good deal. But yeah, it's expensive restoring old buildings. I mean, the carpentry, the stone masonry, the insulation. Unfortunately, bio-based materials, low-carbon materials like the cork and the wood fiber are much more expensive than more conventional petrochemical-based materials. Luckily, with a barn renovation like that, where you don't have a damp-proof course and the walls are very wet, it's kind of a necessity to use a breathable wall insulation. But otherwise, most clients would just say, there's no way we're using that. Let's go for the, what we call PIR insulation in the UK, which is horrible, toxic stuff. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but...
So you're saying it is more expensive because of the technical design, like the aspect of the detailing. Not so much that if you were to rebuild the building in its original material, it would be more expensive, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So we did rebuild it because it was so decayed. As I showed that photograph, that was just the walls. But I guess if you wanted to rebuild it using contemporary methods and contemporary materials, that would be cheaper. But yes, if you're going to do it in a traditional way with stone and lime and carpentry, it's very expensive.
And was that your first restoration project with heritage building? Sort
Yeah,
of?
yeah. So a very steep learning curve. Spent a lot of time on it.
Thank you for the lecture. I have just a very short question, or maybe a comment that you can comment on. It's just that I think when we're studying and we're architects, that many times we look up to star architects like Bjarke Ingels and other like massive studios doing massive crazy things. And I think in some ways it's maybe an expectations to do these insane, crazy, massive things. And it's just so nice to see like your progression, and as you mentioned during your education, that like hands-on learning yourself how to do these kind of like details and things. And I just wonder how this is just like so nice that you just like find your way, and like how you kind of like approach architecture, and you had the possibility to also like win at the like projects and competitions. But I wonder if that's something that you sometimes think about, or if you're just like completely okay with the way you approach things. If you ever think about like, oh, maybe I can apply for this massive museum in Berlin and just like be there with a Chipperfield or something. Like, do you ever have that kind of like obvious success, let's say, or do you just like, no, I just want to do my thing and I'm just very happy to do it and I don't think about it at all?
Well, I had an interesting experience recently, because I think it's funny how quickly, as soon as you start employing other people, I mean, we're still tiny, it's only 7 of us, but quite quickly, as the director, you get a little bit removed from the design process. And now I'm kind of involved in discussions, but I'm not really doing any drawings. I'm not really the one who's in direct contact with the contractor or even the clients in some cases. But I'm doing my own house at the moment, and there was a detail where there was a timber column meeting a stone footing, and it had this brass butterfly key connection. And it was my responsibility to like get everything fabricated, get the butterfly key to the timber framer, and then get a sample of it to the stonemason, and then get the stone delivered to the column. And I just was so happy. It was like a 3-week period where I was on the phone and doing all the logistics. And it was a really interesting moment of, you sort of reflect on which bit of this job do I like. And that's the bit that I really enjoy. So I feel, for me, I mean, things evolve so quickly. Who knows in 10 years' time? But I don't really have aspirations to work on many more projects, or particularly big projects where you lose that connection with the detail and the craft. I mean, as we mentioned, I studied sculpture to begin with, and that interest in materiality and making is still really important. And lots of the people who work with me also have that interest and also do projects on the side. Like the most senior architect who works with me, she teaches on a design and build course in rural Japan. There's another amazing course which I'd recommend called Koshirakura. So she does that every summer, and other people have that interest. So we're all kind of, I think, interested in both scales, how you fix something together and a piece of city like the RCA. And it's such a privilege to be able to work on those two scales. So I think that's what's been really nice about the RCA as well, is doing it with Weatherford Watson Mann, who are leading the project. That is a £60 million project, so again would have been a huge jump up in scale and not something we ever could have done on our own. But being able to work on such a prestigious project of that scale, but actually, be looking at the timber partitions is again a real privilege. So that would be a nice thing to do more of.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, are there some more questions, or not really? Have we some questions on this digital platform?
This is an interesting one. Yes, I'm going to be the curator here. Anyway, have you ever felt in your practice that being a woman is a disadvantage?
Only on a few occasions have I experienced sexism. I mean, tiny comments on the building site, but only on a few occasions. So not explicitly. I would say personally, I've found the experience of juggling motherhood with running a practice incredibly hard. I still find it incredibly hard. That's possibly because my partner is also an architect and he also has a practice, so we're both like in the thick of it. But I personally don't feel that it's really talked about enough how impossible it is to do both at the same time. And I don't really know what the solution is. But yeah, for me, it's more about motherhood rather than womanhood. And I have no insights yet. Come back to me in 5 years or 10 years.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another question, kind of like a follow-up question to this one is it hard to combine your family life, raising your children and being a mother with professional life as an architect? What are the challenges? And I guess maybe a follow-up question from me. It's so interesting that you mentioned that your partner is also an architect, but you don't have the practice together, do you? And like, it's quite common, I mean, at least in Slovakia, that people are architects, are married, have an office together, and I think it's quite special that you don't like work together.
It's probably quite sensible. But my partner already had a practice before we met, which was quite established, so that kind of never came up to do anything together. But no, it's really hard. I mean, I think the truth is that I wouldn't have been able to do it without my mother, so more unpaid female labour propping us up. I mean, my second baby was born in the middle of when Wraxall Yard was on site, and I took about a week off. It was completely crazy, because I didn't have the fees to employ anyone to do it for me. And also, I really understood that it was such an important experience for me to deliver it as project architect. I didn't really want to give it up. And I was lucky that the birth was straightforward and the baby was healthy and I was healthy. So I kind of went back to work straight away. And then to do site visits, it was like an entourage with me, my mum, the baby. We'd have to go and stay the night because it was, although it wasn't even in London, it was like quite a long drive away. And I'd drive up to the site office and take, you know, the pram out, the bouncer, the toys, and the poor baby would have to wait in the site office because I was breastfeeding, so I had to go back every 3 hours. So after that project, I ended up taking a sabbatical. In fact, we took a sabbatical as a family, which was really nice, and went away. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't condone that. Obviously, I think, you know, people should have proper maternity leave and it should be paid, which is definitely not in the UK. But I don't know structurally what the issue, I mean, I don't know what it's like in this country, but basically the fees are really low in the UK, which means if you want to deliver really good work, you know, you have to do lots of, you know, unpaid time, essentially. And so I, you know, still work on the weekend. I mean, I'm trying to have a 4-day week, but at the moment I still work on the weekend. And I guess for me, it's a bit of a, there's a tension because I want to spend more time with the family, but I also feel like the work has to be really good to make it worth not spending more time with them. So I'm kind of stuck in this, you know, I don't want to do bad work. I want the quality to be really high, and to do that just takes time. And it's a struggle to balance that with not fees which aren't really good enough. But I think it's, you know, I don't think that's specific to women. I think my partner probably feels similar, and men probably feel similar. And I think, I guess I feel lucky that things are in my control and that I can choose where our office is, and it's very close to where we live, and I can leave at 3 o'clock if there's a school play, or you know, I don't have a boss breathing down my neck. But I think I think it's a topic that everyone's talking about, and probably not just architecture, but all careers. And I think workplaces are evolving and, you know, flexible working so much more possible with remote working. So I think it's getting better, but it's still hard.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if there are some more questions here. Perhaps, if not, perhaps I would like to cut it like here, because I mean, this was a very nice a message, a last one, because I mean, now you understand that all of you need to be passionate about your work, because without it you can't do architecture, because you will not be paid enough and you will work 24 hours, 7 days a week. So yeah, be prepared for it. But anyway, it's a wonderful job to do.
Yeah, it's a wonderful job. And also, none of my staff work on the weekend, just to be clear. We're really, and I think most good practices now, I think those days, talking about star architects, those days of, I remember going to see the Sana office in Japan, and there was staff like sleeping underneath the
This is Japan.
Those days, I think, are, they're disappearing. I think these days, younger practices would be embarrassed if anyone found out that people were doing overtime, let alone working on the weekend. So I think that's really changed. I think practices who are interested in kind of social value in their projects and the ethics of architecture, you have to have those principles in your own practice as well as in the work. And I think people are kind of looking at things in a much more holistic way. So I think it's going to be better.
Actually, it all starts at the university already, so do not sleep under the decks during this weekend. Go home and rest to be fresh on the next day. So thank you, Clementine, again for your wonderful presentation and for being with us. And thank you, dear students, for being part of the Reflections on Architecture 2025. Thank you.